I was born in Good Samaritan Hospital, 1946, just down the street. I started fishing when I was 4 or 5 years old. Lived here in West Palm Beach until 1951, moved up to Jupiter. So as soon as I was there, I had a little boat at the age of 5, and have been fishing ever since. The Loxahatchee River back in the 50s and 60s was a much healthier ecosystem than it is today. Grass was thick growing on the bottom. The water was a little more tannic. We had more fresh water then, but a much healthier environment. The fishing was fantastic. The reason my father built a house up on the Loxahatchee River is because it was just a paradise for fishing. We didn't have air conditioning back then. The fish would literally keep you awake at night striking through the open windows. A 10-pound trout was not anything unusual. A 30-pound snook would not raise your eyebrows. It was literally unbelievable. Everything was done with plugs. Nobody live bait fished. My first boats were rowboats, and then I moved up to 7-horsepower engines. The river was much shallower in many respects. However, there were not the sandbars we have today. It was just a wonderful place to fish. The mullet runs were unbelievable back in the 50s and 60s. The whole river would become alive, and the tarpon, the snook, the jacks, the ladyfish, bluefish, everything ate the mullet. And that was one particular time I remember when you literally could not stay awake or could not sleep, and would many times be down on the dock fishing. I was fortunate to grow up on a house with a dock, and we'd fish until midnight in many cases, and it was just phenomenal and loud. The noise was almost deafening with the striking all night long. My father started a retail sporting goods store, as he called it, back in 1934 on Datura Street. It was actually at 206 Datura, later moved in 1939 to 125 Datura Street. My father had one of the more unique stores in that he catered to the more elite clientele. It was all around. He still had a lot of the people that from this side of the pond, as we called it, but he also had a lot of interesting characters from Palm Beach, and at that time they were one of the few people that could afford larger boats, fish anywhere in the country they wanted to. A lot of them fished the Bahamas and pioneered Bimini and Walkers and places like that. He carried the big game tackle and is recognized in books by Kip Farrington and Tommy Gifford and some of the other anglers that we know and love as having the big game tackle. And this side of Miami, there was no one else that catered to them. So it was a very interesting store with very interesting clientele. The store, my father again called it Kleiser Sports Shop. Originally he carried boats, he carried outboard motors, he carried tennis rackets, he carried badminton, he carried everything. I don't know about bowling, but he had all kinds of things. He quickly decided that there was a little too much and went just into hunting and fishing after that. The marlin that's hanging in the West Palm Beach Fishing Club, I donated a number of years ago. It was a fish that my father caught, a blue marlin, that my father caught off of Bimini in 1937 with Captain Kenny Foster. The fish was a very prominent fixture in the shop for years. It was the cornerstone of the attraction in the back of the store. The unique thing, the interesting part that most people don't realize, that at the belly of the fish you see some ooze coming out of it. It looks like oil that's dripping out, and of course the early mounts were not fiberglass as they are today. They're skin mounts, and it was hard to get all the oil out of the skin of a fish. A customer had come in the store with a shotgun that was jammed and had a shell in it, and was trying to explain what had happened. And as he was trying to pump the shotgun, fortunately he was pointed down at the floor, which was concrete, and but the gun went off. The pellets ricocheted off the floor into the marlin, and we never could actually clean that the marks that it made. Of course, it had holes in it, but it also oozed out some of the oil, and you can still see that if you look at the belly of the marlin in the club today. My father entered the war, World War II, was drafted in his 30s. Of course, fortunately for him, he got utilized for his expertise in shooting, and was a chief gunner's mate, and was stationed in Hawaii and taught the gunners on airplanes how to shoot. But the shop was actually closed during a period of the 3 or 4 years he was in the war, just mothballed up. Interesting thing is, after the war, no one had any fishing tackle or shotgun shells or that kind of equipment, because all the manufacturers started making war materials. And he literally had a policeman at the front door to let people in the store, and one at the back, so that as people left the store, others could enter, and that's the only place they could find shotgun shells, lures, reels, rods, guns. And he never veered from retail, but then he never went over retail or took advantage of the shortage either. He bought in huge quantities. Always, at that time, the manufacturers sold directly to the dealers, and he bought in bulk, as in grosses of things. So he had huge inventories, and looked at inventory as money in the bank, a little different than they do today. After the war came distributors and middlemen, and in order to keep Dad's volume up, or to buy right, he continued acting as a distributor, and of course stockpiled tons of inventory. Things started changing at that time. The technology started was much more advanced. Probably the war years brought in some of that into effect. He was more traditional and didn't go big box or any of that kind of thing. He started feeling the pain of discounters. He was used to the full retail. In fact, many of the boxes of pin reels and things would have a fair trade price of $10 on them or whatever. You were not allowed to vary from that price. Later on, he got somewhat discouraged with the retail trade, the typical mom and pop feeling of being forced out. In fact, did not recommend that I take over the store. As I went to college, he wanted me to go get a real job, and I started working for Florida Power and Light. My early fishing, I used the same tackle my father did, which was little knuckle buster reels, direct drive, no drag. Sometimes we got a cub drag that you'd have to hold on to the handle, but otherwise you just, with your thumb, that was your drag. We used a Dacron line, and actually a nylon line prior to that, and then we went to a Dacron line. It wasn't until into my teens that I was able to use monofilament and spinning reels, but we used casting reels back then. The shorter rods allowed for you to give more stiff action to a plug and work something like a Zara spook or a plunker, and that's what we used. They were always wooden plugs. This is before when they started coming out with what they call the spooks. That was an indication they were plastic. But every lure we used years ago is considered a collector's item today. Some of my finest recollections of the fishing club, and of course Francis Doucette, who was the fishing club for so many years, was winning some of the awards. This particular award I'm holding up, I won in 1958, making me 12 years old. It was a 10-pound trout which I previously mentioned was a big trout, but in the river it wasn't uncommon, and a 25-pound barracuda that I'd caught offshore. I still have this plaque, which indicates this means a lot to me. I've had it for over 50 years. So these kind of things are just, were very, very special to me, and I can still remember Francis giving it to me. In addition to that, there used to be transoceanic radios. We gave out such things as some of the ambassador reels, a lot of very nice coveted prizes that people were very competitively were seeking, and the fish that were entered years ago, of course, we had the advantage of bigger, nicer, easier to catch fish, but still people fought for those prizes. And Francis was wonderful at making such a big deal out of winning such awards, and you know how wonderful it was, and particularly the children. It's always been about the kids, and that tradition follows all the way through to today.